Okay. Hello, I think that's on. Yes, welcome back. I'm here again in the car, as usual. What's been happening around here? There's been some rain. We've been talking about going on a camping trip, but it hasn't happened. And I was awarded the number one father award, number one dad. It didn't specify only in Japan, but apparently at least one person in Australia and perhaps other countries also got the award, so that, I'm assuming it's just a national one. Still, not bad. Always nice to be recognized for the good work that I do. But yes, and other than that, not too many mind-bending, amazing things have been happening. I've been trying to learn how to do proper networking. Networking in terms of creating a video game that you can play with another person in the world, and with varying degrees of success. There's always something that will trip you up, and in this case it was a slight problem with the documentation. It showed how to do everything and set everything up for creating an online session, joining and hosting, but it kept failing when I tried it. Here we go. Thank you. Yes, kept failing. Would not create a session. And it turns out, although this wasn't shown in the documentation, you have to go into the default engine.ini file and edit in a couple of lines so that there's a default online subsystem. Actually, I say that, but I put in the default as null, which means it's just checking the LAN rather than the internet. But yes, so basically I followed all the directions, but the directions missed out this one vital step that was important regardless of which online subsystem, whether you were using the True Skill system that the Xbox uses, or Steam, or whatever. You would have needed that step. So there you go. That kept me busy for a little while. Apart from that, the question did come up that black holes, obviously, as we know, black holes suck in everything, including light. But if light is massless, if it has no mass for the gravity to act on, then how exactly does a black hole suck in light? Something with no mass. The power of gravity between two things is proportional to the product of their masses. So something without a mass, you're multiplying by zero, right? Well, it turns out gravity doesn't exactly work like that. We can think about it like that, and it's a very useful shortcut, but when you get down to the gravity itself, it is a little bit more complicated. And there's two ways you can think about it, if you're wondering, and I assume you are, how does gravity affect light? One would be to understand that light is a form of energy, and rather than just working on mass, gravity can affect energy as well. And so, there's the amount of energy it has can translate into how much the gravity will affect it. Although there's another way to think about it, which is that gravity doesn't affect objects per se, but instead what gravity does is actually bend space-time. It's like when you're on a trampoline, if you sit in the middle of the trampoline, everything bends down, and so a ball somewhere else on the trampoline would roll down to you. That's the gravity. The black hole is you sitting in the middle of the trampoline, and the light is a ball somewhere on there. It'll naturally roll towards that dip in space-time. Yeah, so that's interesting by itself. But what's even more interesting is if you actually ask a physicist, if you go up to a physicist and say, so which one of those is correct? And they'll quite confusingly say, well, both are. Yeah, and then, qualify and say, oh, well, which one is more correct? And they'll say, well, yeah, they're both equally correct. It really takes a lot to try and understand how that might possibly be. But I'm rambling now. I'll leave it up to you to look that up. It is very interesting. Physicists are not always the most clearly spoken people when it comes to explaining ideas, but the ideas are fascinating. So, especially if you love science fiction, you'll love a bit of the old cosmology. So, let's see. Now, I suppose I should... Oh, yes, what have I been reading at the moment? Let's see if I can do this while I'm driving. This is probably the safest thing I've ever done. Plutarch, Rise and Fall of Athens, which is... Plutarch was an ancient biographer. I would call him a historian, although when it comes to the ancient writers, it's hard to really define which were writing histories and which weren't. But Polybius, he wrote about the lives of various people. They call him a biographer because he wrote biographies, and he wrote lots of them. Now, a lot of them, for example, the first one that he talks about, well, his lives were all paired. He would pair the life of one great leader with another. So, for example, Alexander with Julius Caesar, and Demosthenes and Cicero, and so on. But today, with Penguin, they grouped in more logical groupings. So I'm not. Looks like there's a bit of road work here. While I'm here, this rock that you can see, there are stories about that rock. Apparently they've tried to move it several times, and whenever people try to move it and get rid of that rock, they die. Okay, but anyway, back to Plutarch. So, yes, in the Penguin versions, so for example, this is the Rise and Fall of Athens, there's the there'll be Roman ones and so on. They're more, not necessarily geographically related, but they're all categorized in some way. Anyway, the first one in there is Theseus, and I suppose that's kind of the limit as far back as Plutarch goes. Plutarch was writing in the very early around the sorry, gotta concentrate on driving sometimes. So he was actually writing perhaps 400 years after Alexander the Great, and 500 or 600 years after most of the people in this book at the moment. So in a lot of ways, it's like, one of us as a historian, if I was going to write about, the War of Roses and the Duke of York and, the House of Lancaster and all that sort of thing, it's about the same sort of gap between now and then. So you can imagine trying to find sources now, as we are, about the people back then, is not very easy, and the sources we have are often biased and in other ways either reliable or unreliable. So Plutarch would have faced the same problems, but even worse, because there would have been, books weren't so easily collated as they are now. I can easily look up and see what books are written about this. Even the printing press and the things that made a lot of the writing survive until now didn't exist then. So there's all sorts of transcriptions errors in any type of writing that you look up. They were mainly copied by hand, and people got very good at copying them by hand, of course, but nonetheless, errors crept in. So it is interesting that that way back then he was doing this and going back and writing the lives. And it's also very interesting to see how his interpretation is different from those of the contemporary people, the people who were around at the same time. So, for example, when he talks about Pericles or Themistocles, we have writing from people who actually lived concurrently with them. And Plutarch has his own interpretations, so we can actually see how historians' bias can form and can affect writing. Now, that's not to say that the people who write at the same time that somebody's alive can't be biased either. In fact, it's often the case that if you feel strongly enough to write something about it, it's because you've got an opinion one way or the other. But anyway, getting back to Plutarch himself and his writings, he's one of the more readable ancient authors, I think. If you're going to read biographies, Plutarch and Suetonius are the ones to read. And Plutarch, right now, The Rise and Fall of Athens, the one I read this years and years ago, so I'm going back through it. But it does go back to somebody who was, if not an entirely mythical character, somebody who took on mythical proportions, Theseus, at the start. This was a very common thing back in the ancient world. The further back you go, it's like the ancient maps where, on the edges they have "Here be dragons" or "Beware of frozen oceans" and ice monsters and so on. Things get blurrier and more mythical the further you go. So perhaps Theseus was a real person, perhaps not. Perhaps Romulus and Remus were real, perhaps not. Heracles, maybe he was real, maybe not. But nonetheless, they took on all these elements of divinity. We see that in a lot of different things. Even the Greeks weren't the only ones to do it. The Romans weren't the only ones to do it. Well, the Celts, on the other hand, well, the thing with the Celts is they didn't believe that gods could look like people at all. They laughed. It was at Brennus, laughed at the Romans for having gods shaped like trees. No, not shaped like trees, shaped like people. The Romans laughed at him for, worshipping trees, and he laughed at them for worshipping people. So I can't actually think of an instance where an ancient Celtic character took on mythical proportions, but quite likely there would have been. It's just none of their literature survived. They weren't the most productive writers in the world. Metalworking they were great at, but writing, but yeah, so quite likely it was there. The Egyptians certainly did it. The Assyrians did. The Persians. As long as you go back, even the names. If you get back to it, maybe Marduk was an actual person, and defeated somebody or something, and eventually became worshipped as the one who defeated the one of the creator gods, Tiamat. So. That's not to say he doesn't exist, it's just he does or he doesn't. But yes, it's right now, if you look at the story of Marduk, it is entirely mythical. No way to know for sure. So Plutarch, Theseus is very mythical, but after that all the other ones are very straightforward biographies. Not if you read Suetonius has certain stereotypes and people who look certain ways. You can tell everything about them by if Suetonius says they have a hooked nose or something. Anyway, I really have to go. Catch you next time. Pow. Okay, I'll cut that bit out. And this bit. don't forget to cut this out. Oh, that would be so embarrassing if I left this in.